The first plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading toward their total elimination, is called to order. Mr. Acting President of the General Assembly, Mr. High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Secretary General of the Conference, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all participants to this conference. I should like also to take this opportunity to express once again my deepest appreciation to all states for the great privilege and distinction they have bestowed upon my country by electing me as president of this vitally important conference. Personally, I am indeed honored and deeply indebted to all of you for the trust and confidence you have placed in me. You can be assured that I will do my best with your assistance and cooperation to work towards achieving our collective goal of concluding a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. Si me lo permiten,
if I may, I wish to provide some comments in my native language of Spanish. Those of us gathering here today in this room, we are privileged. These walls have witnessed the clamor of heads of state of all regions of the planet to eliminate nuclear weapons, practically since this building was inaugurated. The wait has been long, that's true, but this clamor has not been in a void. The General Assembly, the most universal body of the United Nations, took a decision to convene this conference to prohibit nuclear weapons and hence lead towards their total elimination. It is said of Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant minds, he said when he was asked a question, what weapon would be able to counter and tackle nuclear weapons? To that question, he responded without hesitation, this can only be possible using the best weapon of all, peace. Achieving peace is a foundational value of the United Nations and the foundation for multilateralism par excellence. And we are witnessing this here today at this conference. In launching this conference, this aspiration for a better world brings me to recall a Costa Rican poet who said once that, I believe in freedom. I believe in freedom in spite of obstacles. I believe in peace, beloved peace, in spite of bombs. We should be guided by dialogue above discord. We must be guided by consensus above negligence. Coexistence must guide us. The smiles of children, we must bear these in mind. And we must recall that peace triumphs above all over nuclear weapons. For me personally, this task began on 16 February when you appointed me as president of this conference. Over the past 6 weeks, we have undergone intensive work in Geneva, New York alike, and I endeavor to do my utmost to ensure that our work is successful and ensure the greatest level of understanding between participants and to work in an orderly fashion. We have had bilateral, multilateral meetings with many of you and across the Atlantic. I've had the opportunity to understand the views of civil society and to exchange on criteria with many from academia and nuclear disarmament realms. Clearly, we are only just beginning in this path. And at this stage, I wish to thank you very much for this spirit of dialogue and your constructive spirit. I also wish to thank the Secretariat and the Costa Rican team, which is led today by our Minister of Foreign Affairs, who has honored us with his presence here today. The task of negotiating a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons is only just beginning today. I wish to appeal to all delegations to join efforts to obtain through this process the best possible results. This week, we will debate aspects relating to this instrument, elements it must contain. We will have substantive and very high-level discussions here. Prior to the sessions, I will try to analyze all the proposals made so that we can have an initial draft. My aim is to prepare this first draft starting in the spring so that we can see the shape of this instrument. Starting today, right now, we are rolling up our sleeves and beginning our work.
I have now the pleasure and honor to invite His Excellency Mr. Massoud bin Momen, Acting President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, to make a statement.
I have the honor to deliver the following statement on behalf of the President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Peter Thompson, who unfortunately cannot be here today due to other multilateral commitments. Good morning to you all. President of the conference, High Representative of the Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Secretary General of the conference, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to thank the President of the conference, Her Excellency Ambassador Elaine Witt Gomez of the Republic of Costa Rica, for inviting me to address today's meeting. For nearly 7 decades, the United Nations has been engaged in long and painstaking discussions to try and rid the world of its nuclear arsenal. While the call to eliminate nuclear weapons has long resonated among all member states, the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons continues to be out of reach. Although current nuclear stockpiles are at the lowest levels since the end of the Cold War, it is self-evidently clear that so long as any nuclear weapons continue to exist, they pose an unacceptable risk to humanity. One misstep, one poor judgment, one technical failure, or one determined non-state actor gaining access to nuclear weapons could lead to unimaginable devastation, including mass casualties and destruction, and long-term health, environmental, climate, economic, and sustainable development consequences. It is no wonder that nuclear weapons continue to be a source of understandable fear and mistrust among nations. In addition, the cost of producing, maintaining, modernizing, and enhancing nuclear weapons diverts large sums of public resources away from other critical areas of investment, including to social and economic services and to sustaining peace, all of which would reduce the threat to international peace and security. Indeed, if the funds currently spent on nuclear weapons were redirected towards implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, great strides could immediately be made in our efforts to strengthen global security. Excellencies, it is in this context that the decision taken by the General Assembly earlier this session to convene a United Nations conference in 2017 to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons creates a window to bring new impetus to nuclear disarmament efforts. I encourage you to bear this in mind as we begin our negotiations. As with any major intergovernmental process, sensitive and complex issues will be raised, but with vision, determination, political will, and a willingness to work together to find common ground, these hurdles can be overcome and a solution that is acceptable to all can be reached. Indeed, all governments have previously committed to pursuing precisely this aim, working towards a world free of nuclear weapons. I wish you all constructive and fruitful negotiations in the coming days. Thank you.
I thank the Acting President of the General Assembly of the United Nations for his statement. I now have the pleasure to invite Mr. Kim Won-soo, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, to make a statement.
Her Excellency, Ms. Ellen White Gomez, President of the Conference, Mr. Masoud bin Momen, Acting President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor to represent the Secretary General at the opening of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. Secretary General Guterres sends his best wishes as well as his sincere regrets. Unfortunately, he is currently traveling on official business. At the outset, I wish to warmly congratulate Ambassador Ellen White Gomez on her election as President of the conference. She will have the full support of the United Nations Secretariat as she seeks to fulfill her historic and challenging task. This conference is taking place against a backdrop of rising international tensions, renewed arms competition, and an absence of results in disarmament bodies. The Secretary General recognized these developments when he recently described our world as a one of new and old conflicts woven in a complex, interconnected web where global tensions are rising, sabers have been rattled, and dangerous words spoken about the use of nuclear weapons. On top of these interconnections are warring trends that are threatening to undo the gains we have made since the end of the Cold War. This makes the need for a breakthrough all the more urgent. Two factors are increasingly impeding the ability of the international community to respond effectively. The first factor is the dismissiveness and defeatism that permeates international deliberations on disarmament. The long paralysis in the United Nations disarmament bodies has prompted many to retreat into entrenched and inflexible positions. This has unfortunately become the new normal. Yet, history has proven that progress on disarmament can only be made when we can pursue inclusive dialogue, respect our differences, and listen to each other in a spirit of compromise and flexibility. The second factor is the diminishing awareness and interest in disarmament issues by the global public. It is hard to imagine these days a gathering of 1 million people in the streets in support of nuclear disarmament as we often saw in the 1980s. We need to find a new way to inspire and motivate the global public in support of disarmament in the same way that they have been energized to respond to the challenge of climate change, an existential threat facing humanity. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the continued existence of nuclear weapons still poses yet another existential threat to humanity. The need for progress in nuclear disarmament has rarely been as urgent as it is today. The doomsday clock, indicating how close the humanity is to global catastrophe, has been set at 2.5 minutes to midnight, worst since 1953, worse than any other time, even at the height of the Cold War. The emergence and rapid dissemination of advanced new types of weapons and related concepts are increasingly creating a double blurring of the line, both between strategic and non-strategic weapons and between nuclear and conventional weapons. Also troubling, countries that possess nuclear weapons are spending billions of dollars to modernize their arsenals and to make weapons that are more capable and more usable. The endless pursuit of nuclear and non-nuclear strategic weapons will not create security. Rather, it has the potential to provoke new and destabilizing arms races and to exacerbate regional and global tensions. These technologies can alter deterrence calculations and may lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons with devastating consequences. If we are to achieve the total elimination of nuclear weapons, we will ultimately need to reverse these trends. The possession of nuclear weapons, which are linked with the threat of their use, is fundamentally incompatible with humanity's common aspiration for peace and security. It will remain difficult to achieve these shared aspirations when countries continue to rely on nuclear weapons in their security doctrines. The strengthening of international norms against nuclear weapons is an important step. To make progress beyond this, we will also need to reflect on the basic objectives of the disarmament process as they are enshrined in the United Nations Charter. In this connection, our goals have always been broader than eliminating or restricting problematic types of arms. Disarmament was meant as an integrated approach to address the larger problem of war and to facilitate arrangements for the collective maintenance of international security. Under the rubric of general and complete disarmament, for the past several decades, member states have pursued systematic and progressive steps toward this end. This approach has led to important instruments, including the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones around the world, as well as bans on nuclear testing, various inhumane weapons, anti-personnel landmines, and cluster munitions. In moving forward, I believe we need to find a way to modernize our historical vision of general and complete disarmament and transform it into a new paradigm for sustainable security. Madam President and distinguished delegate, I would like to conclude with the three personal hopes. First, it is my sincere hope that instrument you are going to negotiate will make a positive and important contribution to nuclear disarmament and to our ultimate objective of general and complete disarmament. The second hope is that the instrument will also strengthen the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and advance us closer to the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Last but not the least, I hope that efforts will continue to be made to seek the inclusive engagement of all states. After all, creating a world without nuclear weapons is a common obligation and responsibility both nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states to share. In this spirit, let us work harder and more creatively so that we can achieve our common goal of a world safer and more secure without nuclear weapons and better for all. I wish you all the best for a successful conference. I thank you so much.
I thank the High Representative for his statement. Before proceeding further,
Madam President, Excellencies,
Before proceeding further, I should like to consult delegations on the delivery of a message from His Holiness Pope Francis by Monsignor Antoine Camilleri, Vice Foreign Minister of the Holy See. If there is no objection, may I take it that it is the wish of the conference, without setting a precedent, to invite Monsignor Camilleri to deliver the message at this meeting? It is so decided. I now invite Monsignor Antoine Camilleri, Vice Foreign Minister of the Holy See, to deliver a message from His Holiness Pope Francis.
Your Excellency, Madam President of the Conference, Excellencies and distinguished delegates. As the head of the Holy See's delegation to the conference, I have been entrusted by His Holiness Pope Francis to share with this important assembly the words that he has addressed to you, Madam President, at this conference, as this conference commences its efforts aimed at eliminating the catastrophic threat of nuclear weapons to world peace. To Her Excellency Elaine White Gomez, President of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. I extend cordial greetings to you, Madam President, and to all the representatives of the various nations and international organizations and of civil society participating in this conference. I wish to encourage you to work with determination in order to promote the conditions necessary for a world without nuclear weapons. On 25 September 2015, before the General Assembly of the United Nations, I emphasized what the preamble and first article of the United Nations Charter indicate as the foundations of the international juridical framework: peace, the pacific solution of disputes, and the development of friendly relations between nations. An ethics and a law based on the threat of mutual destruction, and possibly the destruction of all mankind, are contradictory to the very spirit of the United Nations. We must therefore commit ourselves to a world without nuclear weapons by fully implementing the Non-Proliferation Treaty, both in letter and spirit. But why give ourselves this demanding and forward-looking goal in the present international context, characterized by an unstable climate of conflict which is both cause and indication of the difficulties encountered in advancing and strengthening the process of nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. If we take into consideration the principal threats to peace and security with their many dimensions in this multipolar world of the 21st century, as for example, terrorism, asymmetrical conflicts, cybersecurity, environmental problems, poverty, not a few doubts arise regarding the inadequacy of nuclear deterrence as an effective response to such challenges. These concerns are even greater when we consider the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences that would follow from any use of nuclear weapons, with devastating, indiscriminate, and uncontainable effects over time and space. Similar cause for concern arises when examining the waste of resources spent on nuclear issues for military purposes, which could instead be used for worthy priorities like the promotion of peace and integral human development, as well as the fight against poverty and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We need also to ask ourselves how sustainable is a stability based on fear when it actually increases fear and undermines relationships of trust between peoples. International peace and stability cannot be based on a false sense of security, on the threat of mutual destruction or total annihilation, or on simply maintaining a balance of power. Peace must be built on justice, on integral human development, on respect for fundamental human rights, on the protection of creation, on the participation of all in public life, on trust between peoples, on the support of peaceful institutions, on access to education and health, on dialogue and solidarity. From this perspective, we need to go beyond nuclear deterrence. The international community is called upon to adopt forward-looking strategies to promote the goal of peace and stability and to avoid short-sighted approaches to the problems surrounding national and international security. In this context, the ultimate goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons becomes both a challenge and a moral and humanitarian imperative. A concrete approach should promote a reflection on an ethics of peace and multilateral and cooperative security that goes beyond the fear and isolationism that prevail in many debates today. Achieving a world without nuclear weapons involves a long-term process based on the awareness that everything is connected within the perspective of an integral ecology. The common destiny of mankind demands the pragmatic strengthening of dialogue and the building and consolidating of mechanisms of trust and cooperation capable of creating the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons. Growing interdependence and globalization mean that any response to the threat of nuclear weapons should be collective and concerted, based on mutual trust. This trust can be built only through dialogue that is truly directed to the common good and not the protection of veiled or particular interests. Such dialogue, as far as possible, should include all nuclear states, countries which do not possess nuclear weapons, the military and private sectors, religious communities, civil societies, and international organizations. And in this endeavor, we must avoid those forms of mutual recrimination and polarization which hinder dialogue rather than encourage it. Humanity has the ability to work together in building up our common home. We have the freedom, intelligence, and capacity to lead and direct technology, to place limits on our power, and to put all this at the service of another type of progress, one that is more human, social, and integral. This conference intends to negotiate a treaty inspired by ethical and moral arguments. It is an exercise in hope, and it is my wish that it may also constitute a decisive step along the road towards a world without nuclear weapons. Although this is a significantly complex and long-term goal, it is not beyond our reach. Madam President, I sincerely wish that the efforts of this conference may be fruitful and provide an effective contribution to advancing an ethic of peace and of multilateral and cooperative security, which humanity very much needs today. Upon all those gathered at this important meeting, and upon the citizens of the countries you represent, I invoke the blessings of the Almighty. From the Vatican, 23rd of March, 2017, Francis.
Doy las gracias al representante de la Santa Sede por su declaración en nombre de su Santidad el Papa Francisco. Antes de continuar, quisiera consultar a las delegaciones sobre la proyección de un mensaje de vídeo del señor Peter Maurer, presidente del Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja. De no haber objeciones, puedo considerar que la conferencia desea, sin que ello siente precedente.
If there is no objection, may I take it that it is the wish of the conference, without setting a precedent, to view a video message by Mr. Maurer of the International Committee of the Red Cross at this meeting. It is so decided.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to address this United Nations conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. The prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons is a humanitarian imperative. The International Committee of the Red Cross and the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement know this all too well. In 1945, we witnessed firsthand the horrific effects of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as we attempted to bring relief to the dying and injured. 72 years on, we bear witness to the long-term effects of nuclear weapons as Japanese Red Cross hospitals continue to treat many thousands of victims of cancer caused by radiation exposure. Evidence of the indiscriminate effects and unspeakable suffering caused by nuclear weapons raise significant doubts about their compatibility with international humanitarian law. And today, a large majority of states recognize that the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons must drive efforts towards nuclear disarmament, including those undertaken by this conference. The historic significance of this conference cannot be overstated. More than 7 decades after calls for the elimination of nuclear weapons were first made, states are finally meeting at global level to prohibit these weapons under international law. Of course, adopting a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons will not make them immediately disappear, but it will reinforce the stigma against their use, support commitments to nuclear risk reduction, and be a disincentive for proliferation. It will be a concrete step towards fulfilling existing commitments for nuclear disarmament, notably those of Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. As with chemical and biological weapons, a clear and unambiguous prohibition is the cornerstone of their elimination. Madam President, distinguished delegates, nuclear weapons are the most terrifying weapons ever invented. They are unique in their destructive power, in the unspeakable human suffering they cause, and in the impossibility of controlling their effects in space and time. They threaten irreversible harm to the environment and to future generations. Indeed, they threaten the survival of humanity. So it is in the name of humanity that I appeal to delegates at this conference to work with urgency and determination to adopt a clear and unambiguous prohibition of nuclear weapons grounded in international humanitarian law. In doing so, you will take an essential and historic step towards bringing the era of nuclear weapons to an end. I thank you.
Quisiera ahora consultar.
Thank you. May I now consult delegations with a view to giving the floor to Mr. Toshiki Fujimori, an atomic bomb survivor. If there is no objection, may I take it that it is the wish of the conference, without setting a precedent, to invite Mr. Fujimori to make a statement at this meeting? It is so decided. I now invite Mr. Toshiki Fujimori to make a statement.
President Ambassador White, distinguished delegates, I would like to thank Madam President for giving me the opportunity to speak. My name is Fujimori Toshiki, and I'm the Assistant Secretary General of Nihon Hidankyo, Japan Confederation of Hibakusha Organizations. I'm one of the people who was exposed to the atomic bomb in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Hibakusha established Nihon Hidankyo 11 years after the bombing, and since then, we have called for no more Hibakusha within Japan and abroad. The treaty you will be negotiating today must reflect this call of Hibakusha in express terms, so that the world makes remarkable progress towards nuclear weapons abolition. I was 1 year and 4 months old when the bomb was dropped. We were a big family of 12, consisting of my grandfather, father, mother, 6 elder sisters, 2 elder brothers, and myself. 2 of my elder sisters and my 2 elder brothers had evacuated out of the city of Hiroshima to avoid air raids. The 8 of us who stayed in Hiroshima were exposed to the bomb. My 4th eldest sister was 13 years old, was in her first year of an all-girls junior high school. She was around 400 meters from the hypocenter when the bomb was dropped. Together with her teachers and other students, my sister was there to demolish houses to create fire-safe areas against air raids. All of 676 of them, including my sister, were killed instantly through direct exposure to radiation, the heat, and the blast. Altogether, in the city of Hiroshima, 8,400 students in the first and second year of junior high schools were being mobilized for similar purposes that day. The lives of 6,300 of them were lost. I was sick that day, so my mother was heading to the hospital with me on her back when the bomb was dropped. We were 2.3 kilometers from the hypocenter. Fortunately, a 2-story house between the hypocenter and us prevented us from directly being exposed to the heat. Yet, we were thrown all the way to the edge of the river bank. My mother, with me in her arms, managed to get to the nearby mountain called Ushitayama. Our family members were in different locations at the time of the bombing, but everyone escaped to the same mountain of Ushitayama, except for my 4th elder sister. For many days that followed, my parents, my sisters, kept going back to the area near the hypocenter to look for my 4th eldest sister who was missing. However, we never found her. We never found her body either. In the meantime, I had my entire body covered with bandages, with only eyes, nose, and mouth uncovered. Everybody thought I would die. Yet, I survived. It's a miracle. And I'm here today at the UN asking for an abolition of nuclear weapons. I am convinced that this is a mission I'm given as a survivor. 210,000 people died by the end of 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Beneath the mushroom clouds, Hibakusha experienced hell on earth. In fact, Hibakusha's suffering has continued until today, March 27th, 2017, for the 26,166 days. Nobody in any country deserves seeing the same hell on earth again. Every year on August 6th, my mother would gather her children and would talk to us about her experience in tears. I once asked my mother why she would speak about it if recalling the experience makes her suffer. She just said, "I can't make you go through the same experience." Her tears were her heartfelt appeal. She called as a mother for a world with no more hell on earth. 3 international conferences hosted by Norway, Mexico, and Austria, as well as a joint statement at the prep committee meetings for the NPT review conference and the first committee, repeatedly and strongly reaffirmed the following conclusions. That whether intended or not intended, the effects of a nuclear weapon detonation are not constrained by national orders. That no state or international body could provide relief. That in the interest of the very survival of humanity, nuclear weapons must never be used again, and that the only assurance against the risk of a nuclear weapon detonation is the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Many Hibakusha received these messages, reflecting the long journey that they had come. Nuclear weapon states and the allied nuclear-dependent states are against concluding a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. Despite being the only country in the world that experienced the wartime use of nuclear weapons, the Japanese government voted against the UN resolution which established this negotiating conference. As a Hibakusha and as a Japanese, I'm here today heartbroken. Yet, I am not discouraged. Representatives who are present at this conference from the government, from international organizations, from civil society organizations, you are making efforts to conclude a legally binding instrument to ban and eliminate nuclear weapons. In April of last year, Hibakusha initiated the international signature campaign, which calls on all state governments to conclude a treaty to ban and eliminate nuclear weapons. We reached out to countries across the world, and last October, we delivered our first batch of 560,000 signatures to the chair of the first committee. Today, we have over 1,720,000 signatures with us. We will continue the campaign until 2020, and we aim to collect hundreds of millions of signatures. Let us work together to achieve the nuclear ban treaty. Thank you very, very much for listening.
Le agradezco al señor.
I would like to thank Mr. Fujimori for his very heartfelt and realistic account of his story and of what has happened to him and the motivation for us as we proceed with our work.
Speaker for the opening of the conference. Before proceeding further, I would like to inform delegations that the conference will now proceed to its high-level segment on the understanding that all procedural matters, including the question of participation of the Holy See and Palestine and revisions to the proposed rules of procedure, will be addressed at the meeting at 3 p.m. this afternoon. Members will recall that the conference concluded its consideration of Agenda Item 2, election of the President, and Agenda Item 3, adoption of the agenda, at its organizational session on 16 February 2017. The agenda has since been issued as document A/conf.229/2017/2. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the conference shall now commence its high-level segment under sub-item A of Agenda Item 8. I now give the floor to His Excellency Manuel González Sanz, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Good morning, distinguished delegates. More than 7 decades have passed since the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki days later. This started the arms race and the nuclear era as we know it. Before 1945, the planet was free of such weapons. Today, it is estimated that there are more than 15,000 nuclear warheads circulating. These are capable of eradicating all life on Earth. 1,500 of these are in high alert and can be deployed within a 6-minute time frame. It would only take 300 seconds to decide on the fate of millions. Within these 70 years, we have become very close to a nuclear war. Since the missile crisis in 1962 and the case of Petrov in the 80s, humanity has been under the threat of nuclear weapons. Nuclear annihilation is perhaps the greatest threat facing the world today. And so it is logical and imperative indeed that we gather here today to begin to write a new page in the history of nuclear disarmament. In 1972, we addressed biological weapons. In 1993, we prohibited chemical weapons. 4 years later, in 1997, we did the same with anti-personnel landmines. And in 2008, we adopted a complete treaty addressing cluster bombs. Nevertheless, nuclear weapons, although these are the most devastating of all, are still not prohibited today. And the process being launched here today is clear. We are going to bridge the legal gap and write a new chapter, one that should have been written long ago. History has shown that prohibition has always come first before eliminating a weapon. Prohibiting nuclear weapons will help us to lay out the legal framework for developing and banning the use of nuclear weapons and bombs. A legally binding instrument that we are beginning to draft today, this will not be an end in itself. It will be just another element referring to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. I wish to be clear here. The Prohibition Treaty is not an alternative to any other existing instrument. It is complementary. Costa Rica is firmly committed to a non-proliferation treaty, and we will be celebrating 50 years since the adoption of this. This will be key to horizontal prohibition of nuclear weapons. In a few weeks, we will begin a new cycle in Vienna, a new round. This is in line with the review conference of 2020, and we will advocate for strengthening the three pillars. These must be robust, the three pillars of the NPT, as they are mutually reinforcing, like a triangle. No one can imagine a triangle with just two sides, and the NPT cannot be envisioned without all three pillars. And so we vigorously advocate for the steps set out in the outcome document of the review conference of 2000 to implement Chapter 6 of the NPT. 17 years have passed since these were set out, these provisions. Clearly, the NPT, the prohibition treaty that we are envisaging today, is in line with Chapter 6 of the NPT. Hence, my delegation will appeal for the inclusion of measures to strengthen the NPT in the preamble and the normative part of this treaty to be drafted. This logic of strengthening measures for non-proliferation and for nuclear disarmament involves also a call for those countries who have not ratified the treaty on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty to do so, especially those for which ratification is essential for its entry into force. We must bear in mind the devastating effects of the more than 2,000 nuclear tests. This is a new chapter we are writing today, and this is devoted to all those persons who have suffered from the effects of the use of nuclear weapons for ill will. The Hibakusha and others who were born, for example, in the Marshall Islands, those who were victims of cancer and other diseases as a result of radiation in Semipalatinsk. Their pain is our own pain. We wish to convey our solidarity to all victims to ensure that in the near future, this will never be repeated. We must reassure all inhabitants of the planet that we will have a world free of this nuclear threat. Madam President, delegates, we have a clear date with destiny. The task before us is a major responsibility. There are high expectations. The eyes of the world are watching us here in New York. And today, we recall 2 June, the anniversary of when there were protests in Central Park against nuclear weapons. And to date, that was the largest protest this city of New York has known. This this led to the adoption of the final document of 2010 of the NPT. At that time, we conveyed our deep concern on the humanitarian impact of the use of nuclear weapons. 1 year later, the 33 states of Latin America and the Caribbean, all members of the Tlatelolco Agreement, declared in the first committee that they were ready to join in efforts of the international community, efforts aimed at negotiating a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. This was a declaration made by a pioneering region, Latin America and the Caribbean, one of non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament. 2 years later, in 2013, that declaration was adopted as a resolution in OPANAL, the Agency for Nuclear Prohibition in that area, and repeated in a presidential summit since then. We recently, in Mexico City, commemorated the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Tlatelolco Treaty. Today, this region, which was the first region, the first densely populated region of the world to be free of nuclear weapons, we now have the historic opportunity to work alongside other states present here today towards prohibiting nuclear weapons throughout the world. We also held conferences in 2013 and 2014 on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in Norway, Austria, and Mexico. This was to ensure that in addressing nuclear weapons, we could also address the humanitarian impact above and beyond security doctrine. The last session of the working group, the open-ended working group of the General Assembly, this group made progress in multilateral affairs towards nuclear disarmament, and this took up all of these expectations and conclusions and recommended the convening of this conference, gathering us here today. We are here after a long path, but much remains to be done. Nuclear disarmament is not a task of 5 or 9 states. It is the duty of all of us. What is important is to focus not only on who is here today, but who is present. The importance is to take the first step and then to follow up on this. There will be further steps. No matter how long or complex this path, we will get there. We will get there because we know that with our joint efforts, we can harvest the fruits of our hard work. We know that it is possible to help our grandchildren to have a world free of nuclear weapons. This should only be a parenthesis in the long chapter of history. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias al excelentísimo señor.
I thank Mr. Manuel González Sanz, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica. I should now like to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Alexander Marshik, Vice Minister for Political Affairs from the Federal Ministry for Europe, Integration and Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Austria.
Madam Chair, distinguished delegates, friends, we've gotten used to them, right? We've begun accepting nuclear weapons as part of life. We used to worry much more back at the height of the Cold War. So why don't we worry that much today? Has this danger in any way decreased? Over the past decades, the international community has outlawed weapons that cause unnecessary suffering: chemical, biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions. Those weapons were banned because their consequences were considered ethically inhuman. We know the consequences of nuclear explosion. We have seen the pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We have heard the hibakusha. Why would the logic that applied to the prohibition of chemical and biological weapons, to landmines and to cluster munitions, why would this logic not apply to nuclear weapons, the weapons the use of which would cause much more harm, weapons that could wipe out life on Earth?
In 2014, Austria organized a conference in Vienna to seek answers to these questions. We invited experts to examine and discuss the risks and dangers of nuclear weapons based on the latest available information. For most who attended, and I recognize several here this morning, the conference was a sobering wake-up call about the real risks involved with nuclear weapons today. We learned that the short, medium, and long-term consequences of nuclear weapon explosions are significantly graver than previously understood. We learned that the potential geographical scope of contaminated territory after a detonation was much, much larger than expected. We learned about the countless times that there had almost been a nuclear incident due to a computer error or a mistake or an accident at a storage facility. We learned that due to the gravity of the consequences of nuclear war, it is statistically more likely that our children will die from the consequences of a nuclear explosion than from a car crash. In sum, we learned that we were hugely underestimating the risks associated with nuclear weapons. The conference in 2014 showed in stunning clarity that nuclear weapons carry a risk that is in no way commensurate with their purported advantages. We came away from that conference, and not only from that conference, also from many other meetings on nuclear weapons. We came away with the certainty that we have to do something to reduce that risk, and that the only way to reduce that risk is the prohibition of such weapons through a legally binding instrument. This led many of us on a journey that brings us here together. And many it is. I'm really proud to see such a large number of states assembled in this hall this morning. It shows the broad and the global support for this initiative. But while it's gratifying to see so many states here today, it remains unfortunate that several are absent. Not all states are yet convinced of our initiative. Several important partners have concerns, in particular the nuclear weapon states, and we heard them this morning, and we thank them for their readiness to engage with us and for their effort to come here and to lay out their positions. We would prefer to see them here inside this room, but it is necessary, we need this dialogue, and it is necessary to look at these concerns that are raised, and it is necessary to try to convince them and to address them. Because we do have compelling arguments to convince these partners that we are right. And also because we need all states to join our initiative if we want to be successful and reduce the risk of nuclear weapons to zero. So let me very briefly turn to some of the concerns. Some say that nuclear weapons are here to stay. You cannot de-invent nuclear weapons. Well, de-inventing nuclear weapons is not necessary. Prohibition suffices. From other weapons prohibition treaties, we know that we can set up treaty regimes with strict verification controls. We've seen this in the nuclear field. The NPT system, the JCPOA, they've established complex verification mechanisms that can be built on and expanded. Independent experts have elaborated highly sophisticated blueprints for comprehensive safeguard systems. And don't forget that the prohibition treaty that we are trying to negotiate here today, this week, this year, that's only a necessary first element, a necessary first step that would need to be complemented by a comprehensive set of additional sequenced measures to achieve the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And we know very well this is going to take time. But that should not deter us. We should take the first step by laying out the goal of the process, the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Another concern is that the prohibition of nuclear weapons could reduce security. Now, let me be very clear. Nobody in this room wants to make any state less secure or any person less safe, whether they come from a nuclear weapon state or a non-nuclear weapon state. indeed every state, including every nuclear weapons state and every umbrella state, would be more secure and their people would be more safe if no state had nuclear weapons. This is an important argument to make because it's very clear. Our final goal of a world without nuclear weapons can only be achieved if nuclear weapon states participate. Only they can disarm. We can't. And nuclear weapon states will only do so if they feel they will gain more security. So we must demonstrate that it is possible to gain more security by joining this effort. We must explain that no single nuclear weapon state will be asked to unilaterally disarm. What we seek is a general legal prohibition. And once we have that, then we will establish, together with everyone concerned, a system of eliminating nuclear weapons altogether. And one more point in this context that I think is very important. The argument that nuclear weapons are indispensable for security. That argument runs counter to the many commitments in the NPT context. If nuclear weapons were truly indispensable in providing security, then why should not all states benefit from that advantage? If we follow that argument that nuclear weapons make the world safer, would that not imply that more weapons from more states would be better? Now, we do not believe that argument. Clearly, we will only be safer with less nuclear weapons, with no nuclear weapons. Only that would bring more security for everyone. Another concern is the relationship of the Prohibition Treaty to the NPT. In 2015, we witnessed once again a failure of the NPT regime, but still it remains the best system of nuclear security that we currently have, the cornerstone of the international nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regime. So we have to protect, we have to strengthen the NPT. And that's what our prohibition will do. It will not only be fully compatible with the NPT, it will build on Article 6 and contribute to its implementation. It won't weaken the NPT, quite the contrary, it will strengthen it. Finally, we often hear that this is not the right time for such an initiative. We have been waiting for progress on nuclear disarmament since 1997 now, but it's 20 years. For the last 20 years, the Conference on Disarmament has not been able to agree on a program of work. The action plan agreed at the NPT Review Conference in 2010, which contains concrete actions on nuclear disarmament that all the NPT states agree to, still awaits implementation. Whenever we ask, we were told it's not the right time for nuclear disarmament right now. Either the times were good and there was no real need for it, or the times were difficult and elections were coming up, or a financial crisis, or the geopolitical tensions were out there. Frankly, it never seems to be the right time. If we look at history, however, we can see that nuclear disarmament occurred during the Cold War, and it occurred during post-war peace. And from the same history, we learn that there was nuclear disarmament when political leadership was determined to achieve progress in that area. Today's international security environment may be challenging, but this should not serve as an excuse. At the height of the Cold War, the leaders of the US and the USSR engaged in bilateral nuclear talks enabling the START and INF treaties. Let us also not forget that what we seek is, strictly speaking, not a disarmament treaty. This is a process to prohibit a type of weapon that carries enormous risks and when detonated can cause enormous human suffering. There is no wrong time for that. And quite frankly, what's the alternative? Is doing nothing a better strategy? Some ask, why go through all this hassle? Just lean back and wait for a nuclear accident and wait for some detonation. Then states will come together and ban nuclear weapons. I refuse to accept that. Waiting for disaster is not strategy. That is disrespectful of the victims of nuclear weapons, past and future. There is a right time to begin the process of prohibiting nuclear weapons, and that time is now. Madam President, if I may have one last point on procedure, I would like to thank the members of civil society who have worked for years and decades on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It's largely thanks to your dedication, expertise, and perseverance that we are here today, and it's an honor and a privilege to work with you. Many thanks goes also to the colleagues at the UN Secretariat and other international organizations, and to many government delegates who have been working in the arms control sector around the world. But I also have a request for the friends here assembled in this room. This is one of those rare opportunities that we have as diplomats, where we could make history. Or we could also stumble and miss this opportunity. There's a risk that we want to achieve too much. There's a risk that we get distracted, that we lose sight of our goal. There's a risk that we try to satisfy individual, national, political agendas. Every one of us has national interests. Everyone can make this process difficult or easy. My request to you, dear friends, please let us stay together behind this one clear objective, a legal prohibition of nuclear weapons. We will only achieve that if we are disciplined, if we put the common goal ahead of the national agenda. Everything else can come later, and it will have to come if we want to succeed. But here and now, we must focus on this one goal, the prohibition of nuclear weapons. If we don't, and if we succumb to temptation, if we get tangled up in individual national priorities, we will most likely fail. That may not be the end of the world, but with nuclear weapons involved, it may be just that. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Alexander Marsik, Vice Minister for Political Affairs, Federal Ministry for Europe, Integration and Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Austria. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Miguel Ruiz Cabañas, Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, ministers, vice ministers, distinguished delegates, on behalf of the government of Mexico, Madam President, I wish to congratulate you on your election to preside over this UN conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. This is a historic day indeed. Our struggle for nuclear disarmament is well known by all those here. For more than 70 years, Mexico has been insisting on the need to free humanity of nuclear weapons. As was noted by the President of the Republic, Enrique Peña Nieto, during the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Tlatelolco Treaty on February 14th, at that time he said, and I quote, "There are threats that continue to be latent, that have not changed. These include the destructive power of nuclear weapons. This is perhaps the most serious threat. That is why it is urgent to make progress towards a universal legal instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons," end quote. Since the first nuclear detonation, Mexico unilaterally adopted the decision to never develop nuclear weapons or to allow the installation of nuclear weapons in another country in our territory. Our Constitution sets out that nuclear energy can only be used for peaceful means. Today, the great majority of the international community endorses that position too. The Tlatelolco Treaty is clear evidence of this. For 50 years, the states of Latin America and the Caribbean have we decided to abandon our individual interests and focused on the common good. This is the political will which goes towards prohibiting nuclear weapons. This dream of a world free of nuclear weapons is not a pipe dream. There are other 4 zones free of nuclear weapons, plus Mongolia, which show that this is a reality in more than half of the world's surface. However, this responsibility does not only fall to members who are parties of these areas of that are free of nuclear weapons. All states parties to the NBT which is the cornerstone of non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament, all parties to the NPT must continue to reinforce efforts to achieve the universality of this treaty, including states that remain outside as non-nuclear weapons countries. And this treaty being discussed here to prohibit nuclear weapons will not be a substitute to the NPT. On the contrary, it will be complementary and in line with the obligation under Chapter 6 of the NPT, which says that each state party is committed to negotiations in good faith on effective measures for stopping the nuclear arms race in the near future and commit to nuclear disarmament and a general complete disarmament effectively supervised internationally. These two instruments should complement each other, strengthening the non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament regime. Madam President, Mexico has always actively been a party in multilateral efforts to tackle global challenges. We have always favored strengthening universal forums, especially under the United Nations. And today is no exception. Mexico will champion multilateralism to strengthen the cause of nuclear disarmament. That is what brings the majority of states to our parliaments and civil society. This motivates us because it is a cause for humanity, and this is indeed a timely moment to make progress in this gargantuan task. Nuclear weapons still represent a threat to the global population and to development, to environment, food security. The mere existence of nuclear weapons is a global threat. Therefore, it is in the interest of us all to endeavor towards general and complete disarmament. Almost 3/4 of the humanity are not dependent on nuclear weapons. We cannot argue that these are a pillar for disarmament. As was noted more than 10 years ago in 2007 by George Shultz, William Perry, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn, with the end of the Cold War and new threats of terrorism and nuclear proliferation, depending on nuclear weapons to maintain international security is increasingly dangerous and increasingly less effective. We must ensure security and protection of our people in the face of devastating effects of a possible detonation, one which is intentional or accidental. It would only take an accidental detonation in any of our cities for us to witness once again a humanitarian catastrophe that is impossible to adequately address. Madam President, 2/3 of the United Nations membership supports the cause of prohibition of nuclear weapons. That is no coincidence. From our experience with other weapons of mass destruction, we know that categorical prohibition brings with it the start of a process towards elimination. While their responsibilities to weapons states, normative aspects should be addressed to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe. Today, it is not to nuclear weapons state that this responsibility falls to, but all of us. This is not only about our leadership, it is a global responsibility. Nevertheless, we will continue to endeavor to ensure that, in accordance with the UN principles, each state joins in this cause for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Madam President, Mexico seeks very clear objectives for this legally binding instrument being discussed here today and for the negotiation of this. First, we believe that the negotiations process will need to be swift and straightforward. Mexico will prioritize any initiative towards that end, as well as avoiding any distractions from processes that seek to make complementary contributions to the non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament regime. Next, we believe that the text of the treaty should be clear and concise. It should focus on the main goal, and that is to prohibit the use, acquisition, stockpiling, development, transfer, and stationing or deployment of atomic arms, as well as the participation and assistance of states parties, or also the participation in any activity prohibited by this treaty. Thirdly, we must ensure that this treaty be inclusive and open to all states. Those states which are nuclear states will have an instrument so that they can make good on their commitment towards nuclear disarmament, and this will be a binding obligation. Mexico believes that this treaty on prohibition will be an extension, a global one. Accession to this instrument will depend on political will of each state, including non-nuclear states. The treaty in itself doesn't mean that states have to get rid of their stockpiles, but we hope that through collective will of the international community, we will be able to ensure that we can achieve this objective in the near future. Madam President, under the proposals, the purposes and principles of the UN, and in line with Article 1 of the Charter, Mexico believes that a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons is essential. Through a constructive spirit, we will promote for this treaty to establish a high, explicit standard prohibiting nuclear weapons. Mexico is working towards prohibition of nuclear weapons. We do so with enthusiasm and very seriously and with responsibility. We trust that together we will achieve this historic cause that brings us here today in the United Nations. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Alexia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruiz Cabañas, Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Alfredo Labbe, Advisor to the Minister and Special Envoy for Nuclear and International Security of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile.
Madam President, dear colleagues, friends, may I, Madam President, first of all congratulate you on your election to preside over this conference. This is very auspicious in Chile's view that Costa Rica, exemplary supporter of peace, is the country leading our efforts to achieve a global conference on prohibiting nuclear weapons. 50 years after the entry into force of the Tlatelolco Treaty, which demonstrated that it is legally and politically possible to move ahead towards international peace and security by prohibiting the most devastating weapon created by the human race. Against this backdrop, may I support what has been said by the Republic of Salvador on behalf of CELAC. And I would like to add a few specific points from the national perspective of Chile. Madam President, we have arrived here after following a truly multilateral path, enabling us to build a coalition of states that hold peace dear in support of the Austria Pledge. And we cannot be indifferent to the possible fallout of a use of nuclear weapons. We are not just states, we include civil society and academia who are crucial to advancing modern multilateral diplomacy, where we have to move ahead together until that day when nuclear weapons cease to exist. In particular, the presence and the participation of civil society is absolutely crucial to our broadening and deepening the legitimate nature of what we are trying to do. We are seeking legitimacy for all that is being done in the international community on a multilateral basis. We operate on the basis of the Charter of the United Nations, which has where war is sometimes regarded as legitimate. But the use of this particular weapon would be flouting the basic principles, and this weapon of mass destruction must be totally prohibited. We had the Oslo, Nagariz, and Vienna conferences, and that was a healthy demonstration of what democracy can do. And we saw that abuse of the rule of consensus had occurred. Any policy has to be led by democracy, the rule of law, participation, transparency. And it is helpful to recall that the General Assembly, which is the principal organ of our organization, is governed by Article 11 of the Charter. Madam President, the celebratory tone of the adoption of L41 last year must not blind us to the fact that we have successfully carried out the initial step in this travel that we must carry out together. So whatever the legal nature of the instrument to emerge from our conference, the final objective of what we are doing today is to totally eliminate nuclear weapons for the benefit of international security. We want to work together cooperatively to ensure security and safety for the entire human race. When we see what the impact of nuclear weapons is, we must conclude that nuclear weapons are the greatest, the most important factor in human insecurity today. And so we have to seek to enhance our security. But we are caught in the Faustian trap. Legally prohibiting nuclear weapons must be seen as a liberating initiative which will free us from the nuclear threat, free us and the entire human race. We are making this huge diplomatic effort. It must not be seen as a hostile action vis-à-vis the nuclear powers. Rather, it must be seen as a very friendly, positive step towards ensuring our vision of a world free from nuclear weapons, which was indeed envisaged by the former President Barack Obama. In this General Assembly, we are seeking to add to the global architecture of peace and security. We want this one element to be included as strengthening that architecture, that structure. there have been some concerns voiced by some friends to the effect that our efforts might be detrimental to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but there is nothing further from our intention. Quite clearly, the NPT must continue as a keystone of international peace and security, and we truly want to keep that. We have to, however, working harder for non-proliferation. The nuclear genie has been released from its bottle and it exists. And so the international community has to preserve all of those measures it has to ensure that peaceful nuclear energy can be continued. Under the provisions of Article 6 of the NPT, the mandate of achieving nuclear disarmament is a responsibility for all states parties to that treaty. And so we have an obligation which we must respect. And Chile believes that we must work to ensure that the instrument on prohibiting nuclear weapons will simply add to the arsenal of instruments prohibiting nuclear weapons. And this will help us to get a better, fairer, and more peaceful world. This is, after all, what we are seeking in Agenda 2030. May I conclude by emphasizing the need for the international community to have this new instrument. We must work on our policy to ensure mutual trust, which is what is crucial to advancing international peace and security and disarmament. Madam President, you already have our strong support and commitment. We will continue working tirelessly to achieve our goal. Thank you very much, Madam.
Muchas gracias al excelentísimo señor.
May I thank His Excellency Mr. Alfredo Labe, Advisor to the Minister and Special Envoy for Nuclear and International Security of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile. I call now on His Excellency Mr. Bayani S. Mercado, Assistant Secretary, Office of the United Nations and other international organizations of the Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines. He will also be speaking on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. You have the floor, sir.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, namely Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Lao People's Democratic Republic, Malaysia, Myanmar, Thailand, Singapore, Vietnam, and my own country, the Philippines. ASEAN congratulates you, Madam President, on your election as President of this important conference. And thank you for accepting the responsibility of shepherding this exercise to what we trust will be a fruitful conclusion. You can be assured of our support and constructive participation. Madam President, the universal goal of a nuclear zero has never seemed so unreachable. In spite of standing commitments towards total nuclear disarmament, we see today states who are increasing their nuclear weapons arsenals, who are developing new technologies that make it even easier to transport them, and who have not lived up to their commitments and their obligations under international law. The multilateral disarmament machinery has yet to produce any meaningful progress in the non-proliferation and disarmament arena in more than a decade. It is against this backdrop that we must reaffirm our commitment to realize the goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons pose the greatest threat to humankind. Their presence provides a false sense of security that in reality threatens international peace, stability, and prosperity. As long as nuclear weapons exist, there still remains the risk of accidental, mistaken, unauthorized, or intentional nuclear weapons detonations, exposing humanity and the environment to their catastrophic effects, as well as the increasing danger of nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands of non-state actors. We are convinced that ultimately, the total elimination of nuclear weapons is the only absolute guarantee against their use or threat of use. This belief underpins ASEAN's commitment to preserving our region as a nuclear weapons-free zone as enshrined in the Bangkok Treaty. The same belief inspired us to align ourselves with the humanitarian pledge that recognizes the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and to vote in favor of General Assembly Resolution 71/258 that mandated the holding of this conference. The same belief is the driver in our unwavering commitment to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT, which we recognize remains the cornerstone in the non-proliferation regime. And this same belief is what brings ASEAN here today, as a group, to contribute to the vital work of negotiating a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. Madam President, ASEAN's view is that this conference is a vital step in the path toward nuclear disarmament. The NPT itself calls on states as part of the legal obligation to pursue in good faith effective measures to fill the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons, which are aimed at contributing to the full implementation of Article 6 and achieving and sustaining a world without nuclear weapons. This conference, therefore, does not aim to supplant the NPT, but complements and reinforces that treaty's goals and objectives. ASEAN would also like to recall the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legality on the threat or use of nuclear weapons, that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all aspects under strict and effective international control. Madam President, ASEAN has always upheld and attached great importance to the respect to and compliance with the fundamental objectives and principles of the UN Charter in the maintenance of international peace and security, including non-use or threat to use of force, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and settlement of disputes by peaceful means in accordance with international law. ASEAN approaches this conference guided by the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty, which we consider to be ASEAN's most important contribution to the global aspiration of a nuclear-free world, and the NPT, to which we reaffirm our unwavering commitment. Allow me, Madam President, to proffer a few reflections on the legally binding instrument that we hope to produce at the end of this exercise. At the heart of the instrument should be the express prohibition of possession, test or use, production or manufacture, acquisition, development, stockpiling and transfer of nuclear weapons, and assistance and encouragement in any form to anyone, in particular non-state actors, to engage in the above activities. The instrument should not impinge on the inalienable right of member states to the peaceful use of nuclear energy, in particular for their economic and social development. State parties should therefore undertake to use exclusively for peaceful purposes nuclear material and facilities under international standards of safeguards without discrimination. The instrument should not stigmatize countries, but nuclear weapons. The instrument agreed to should be inclusive and allow for other states possessing nuclear weapons and those with defense arrangements with them to become parties in the future. We encourage discussion that would lead to a system to verify state parties' compliance with their obligations under the instrument. In this matter, transparency is key, and the instrument should provide for mechanisms for reporting, verifying, and exchange of information, as well as for clarifying and resolving cases of non-compliance. At the appropriate time in the future, there may be a need to establish and maintain a body that would oversee the implementation of the instrument and ensure compliance with its provisions. Finally, the instrument must have the necessary provisions allowing for amendments, periodic review of its implementation, settlement of disputes, duration, and withdrawal. Madam President, through this conference, we have the opportunity to change the course of the disarmament process and achieve meaningful progress towards achieving our universal goal of a world without nuclear weapons. ASEAN calls on the participating states to keep our focus on this goal and work together in the spirit of mutual understanding, solidarity, and transparency. At this point, Madam President, allow me now to deliver the Philippines statement. The Philippines join other delegations in congratulating you on your appointment as President of this historic conference, a conference that many of us will certainly work tirelessly on to finally make progress on an important commitment we have made more than 4 decades ago under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Yours will be a daunting task, and the Philippine delegation assures you of our support throughout this session and the next. The Philippines is participating in this conference as an affirmation of our unequivocal commitment to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. We especially attach great importance to this cause, guided by the Philippine Constitution, which mandates us to adopt and pursue a policy of freedom from nuclear weapons in our territory. As an active member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which the Philippines currently chairs, my country is also signatory to the Bangkok Treaty that created a nuclear weapons-free zone in Southeast Asia. While the Philippines does not possess nuclear weapons, it is incumbent upon our government to protect the millions of Filipinos living and working in countries that are vulnerable and susceptible to nuclear harm. And by nuclear harm, we do not simply refer to state-sponsored attacks and those by non-state actors, but also those that may be caused by natural calamities, such as what happened in Fukushima. It is plain and simple, and we will keep on saying it, that so long as nuclear weapons exist, the threat to humanity's destruction is imminent and real. Madam President, this conference will not be possible if not for determined efforts over the past years by many member states to jumpstart discussions on nuclear disarmament. I wish to recall the successful 2010 NPT Review Conference, during which member states expressed, and I quote, deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and reaffirms the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law, unquote. The humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons cannot be underestimated. No state will be able to effectively respond to a humanitarian crisis as a result of an accidental, mistaken, unauthorized, or international detonation of a nuclear weapon. The personal account of Mr. Fujimori this morning gives us a glimpse of the horrors and the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. Madam President, this conference is also an answer to Article 6 of the NPT, whose implementation is long overdue. Each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date into nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. The Philippines takes the view that this conference and its objectives do not undermine the NPT, but on the contrary, strengthens this landmark treaty. No less than the International Court of Justice penned in its advisory opinion of 8 July 1996 that, quote, there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control, unquote. Sadly, more than 2 decades later, the international community still struggles to fulfill this obligation. It is for these reasons that the Philippines joined 113 member states in calling for this conference under UN General Assembly Resolution 70/33 to arrive at a legally binding instrument which will put all nuclear weapons of the world finally on the path of extinction. Only through a transparent and inclusive process of diplomacy and dialogue will the nuclear disarmament agenda be kept alive and succeed. And so, we lament the fact that some member states, including those that possess the world's greatest nuclear arsenals, have opted not to participate in a conference whose aim complements their own of a nuclear weapon-free world. We have a common ground and no ground for disagreement. The onus is on them to demonstrate to the world that they remain committed to their own cause of nuclear disarmament. The Philippines is very much cognizant of present geopolitical realities. It is precisely because of these geopolitical dynamics that we must all the more secure the world from nuclear weapons. There will never be a better time than now to discuss the prohibition of such weapons. Madam President, as we commence our discussions, I would like to take this opportunity to state in general terms the Philippine positions. First, the Philippines believes that the most viable option for immediate action is to negotiate a legally binding instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons and pronouncing an unambiguous political commitment to the achievement and maintenance of a world free of nuclear weapons. The instrument may contain a phased program and time frame for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons for states that possess nuclear weapons once they acceded to the treaty. Second, the treaty must contain provisions for a verification system. The treaty will be naught if we have no system in place to confirm that state parties are abiding by their obligation. Furthermore, a system must be in place to ensure that states that possess nuclear weapons after acceding to the treaty are indeed reducing their stockpiles and are dismantling and destroying their weapons, and that the process they are undertaking is irreversible. The Philippines maintains that the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has proven to be beneficial to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation by stigmatizing nuclear test explosions. However, this is not a substitute for a permanent, legally binding commitment to end nuclear weapons testing and all other nuclear explosions, which can be achieved by the entry into force of the CTBT. Once the treaty is in force, member states will be able to request on-site verification if they suspect a nuclear explosion has taken place in violation of the treaty. Third, we fully support the creation at the appropriate time of a secretariat with its own staff to facilitate the treaty implementation. Fourth, we must also prepare to assist states in fully implementing the obligations that are to be included in this treaty. Our prohibition treaty must have mechanisms able to provide assistance to states in need so as to ensure compliance. Lastly, Madam President, the Philippines expresses fervent hope that member states would remain true to their commitments and contribute actively to our discussions in the days ahead with the needed flexibility. Thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco al excelente.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Bayani Mercado, Assistant Secretary of the Office of the United Nations and other international organizations, Department of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines. I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Oman to the United Nations, speaking on behalf of the Group of Arab States.
السيد الرئيس، باسم المجموعة العربية أتقدم إليكم بخالص التهنئة لانتخابكم لرئاسة هذا المؤتمر، ونعبر لكم عن الدعم في إدارة أعماله. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة الحضور.
Excellencies, the Arab group reaffirms in this regard and stresses that the foundation of peace, security, and stability in the world cannot be achieved with the existence of nuclear weapons that threaten international peace and security. This makes it imperative to rid mankind of such weapons and harness the immense human and financial resources devoted to them in the service of sustainable development and welfare of the peoples of the world. We also affirm that this conference is a concrete step to arrive at a verifiable, non-discriminatory, and comprehensive instrument to prohibit the use, possession, production, or stockpiling of nuclear weapons in order to achieve the lofty global aim of the total, definitive, and irrevocable elimination of nuclear weapons. The international community has consecrated this objective when it declared the 26th of September the World Day of Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. Madam Chairperson, the Arab group expresses concern over the continued failure to achieve tangible progress towards the prohibition of nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament, and the repeated failure in commitment to the implementation of the second decision of the second conference on the extension of NPT of 1995, and also the 13 steps adopted by the NPT Review Conference of the year 2000, in addition to the provisions of the Plan of Action adopted in the 2010 conference, when the nuclear conferences shirked clearly the commitment to set specific timeframes to honor those international obligations for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. The Arab group also, in its entirety, expresses the rejection of the continued adoption by the nuclear weapons of military doctrines allowing the use of such lethal weapons and even permitting their use against non-nuclear states. In this context, the group affirms that the complete and final elimination of nuclear weapons under Article 6 of the NPT is the only guarantee for the non-use of such weapons. Also, the objectives of this UN process and the objectives of the future instrument are in line and consistent with the provisions of the NPT and complement the track that was begun with the non-proliferation in 1970 and continued through the activation of the humanitarian ban and legal prohibition through the current process in order to arrive at a world free of nuclear arsenals through effective and institutional international effects to achieve the full commitment by all without discrimination to the nuclear disarmament. The Arab states, Madam Chairperson, will continue their positive contribution in this global endeavor towards nuclear disarmament, in which they have been engaged through their effective participation in all relevant fora and through the accession of all the Arab states without exception to the NPT, and their placing all their nuclear facilities under the safeguards system of the IAEA, which Israel has failed to do despite the international resolutions in this regard. In this context, the Arab group reiterates its condemnation of the continued threat of international peace and security, especially in the Middle East region, as on the ecological, humanitarian, and security level as a result of Israel's continued possession of its nuclear arsenal as the only one in the Middle East, refusing to comply, which is a gross violation and a blatant defiance of relevant international resolutions. The Arab states, after the passage of more than 20 years, reaffirm their profound preoccupation and grave concern over the continued delay in the implementation of the international obligation under the resolution of 1995, providing for the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, which represents a serious setback of the efforts of the prohibition of nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament globally. Finally, Madam Chairperson, the group of states members of the Arab League realize that the agenda we are engaged in imposes on all of us a delicate and difficult task, but this should not thwart our ambition. Rather, it should spur us to further efforts towards commitment to the mobilization of the necessary political will to ensure the success of this conference. The entire group affirms that it is committed to working with you and with all the states participating in this historic conference towards a world free of nuclear weapons. Before concluding, I would like to affirm the fact that the Arab group affirms the importance of the participation of the State of Palestine and the Holy See in the activities of this conference and in the debate to be held this afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Le agradezco al representante.
I thank the permanent representative of Oman to the United Nations and now give the floor to the permanent representative of El Salvador to the United Nations. Speaking on behalf of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the states that are a member of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC. We wish to congratulate you, Madam Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, Permanent Representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations in Geneva. We congratulate you on being elected to preside over our deliberations. It is an honor for the region to have you presiding over this important work, and we assure you, Madam, of our support to a successful outcome of our work here. Our region is the first densely populated region of the world declared free of nuclear weapons through the Tlatelolco Agreement. It is the first to have been declared a zone of peace by the 33 states of CELAC who have participated in the conference. The view is to achieve significant progress towards the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. We reiterate our deep concern vis-à-vis the threat to humanity that nuclear weapons represents, both through their use and threat of use, as well as the humanitarian impact. We wish to underscore that nuclear weapons must not be used under any circumstances. The use and threat of use of nuclear weapons is a crime against humanity and a violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law. It also violates the United Nations Charter. Accordingly, the only effective guarantee in addressing the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is to have complete prohibition, a transparent, verifiable, irreversible prohibition within a clearly defined time frame. We reaffirm the urgent need to move towards our main objective of complete and general disarmament under international monitoring to ensure the prohibition and elimination of all nuclear weapons. In this respect, we reiterate our intention to join in and actively participate in negotiations that we are beginning today here at the United Nations towards a universally legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons in a transparent, irreversible, verifiable way and under a multilaterally agreed time frame leading towards the total elimination of these weapons. Madam President, we reaffirm our state's commitment to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and full implementation of the three essential pillars: nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful use of nuclear energy. The community also reaffirms the inalienable right of states to develop and peacefully use nuclear energy without discrimination, in accordance with the NPT. CELAC underscores the importance of achieving universality of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and therefore we urge those states that have not yet done so to accede to this, including non-nuclear weapons states, and also urge weapon states to comply with the obligations under Article 4 of the NPT, including in participating in these negotiations towards the full elimination of these weapons. This negotiations process for a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, this contributes towards implementation of Article 4 of the NPT indeed. Madam President, together we are on this common joint endeavor towards a legally binding instrument. CELAC has acted in line with our responsibility in building a peaceful, safe world, one free of nuclear weapons. We urge all other states to join us. CELAC states reiterate our full commitment towards a significant and successful outcome of this conference, and we reaffirm that we stand ready to work together with you, Madam President, towards achieving this objective. Madam President, given that these rules only allow for a state to speak once, I'd like to add 3 comments in my national capacity. El Salvador wishes to make all effort in order to avoid failure here towards building a legally binding instrument, one prohibiting nuclear weapons. We have come here to this conference firmly believing in supporting this and to avoid a catastrophe of major proportions. My country, in a view of the tremendous catastrophic threat that represents nuclear weapons, we must have a legal framework, just as has been achieved for prohibiting the use and existence of biological weapons and chemical weapons. There is a framework for those. Nevertheless, nuclear weapons, their threat still looms large. Therefore, Madam President, the people of all the world must join forces here. Madam President, El Salvador believes firmly that nuclear energy must be used only for peaceful means. We recognize the sovereign right of all countries of the world to use nuclear technologies as long as this is exclusively used for peaceful means and under parameters that have been established by the NPT. Lastly, Madam President, I wish to reiterate my delegation's support and my own support to you in your task of presiding over our efforts. Trust that under your leadership, we know that this conference can be a success. Madam President, in a nuclear war, there would be no aggressors or aggressed or neutral parties. That's a fiction. All parties involved, whether neutral or aggressors, all of us would be victims in the disappearance of civilization as we know it today. We must eliminate such threat. That is a sine qua non, an imperative for us all. Thank you.
Muchas gracias al representante.
I thank the permanent representative of El Salvador to the United Nations and give the floor now to the permanent representative of Cabo Verde to the United Nations, speaking on behalf of the group of African states.
Madam Chair, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the African Group. The African Group assures you of full cooperation as we exchange views and deliberate on the mandate given by the General Assembly Resolution 71/258 to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination.
Madam President, the African Group believes that the total elimination of nuclear weapons and the legally binding assurance that they will never again occur, this is the only absolute guarantee against their use or the threat of their use. Accordingly, the African Group reaffirms that it is urgent that our world, including in outer space, be free of nuclear weapons. This is because the presence of nuclear weapons is an existential threat to the planet, to global peace, and to the survival of humanity. The international community continues to await achieving this goal of total elimination of nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the African Group has been endeavoring to find specific and deeper measures to ensure nuclear disarmament. Clearly, current approaches have been insufficient towards achieving tangible results that would enable us to achieve the global objective and the objective of nuclear disarmament. Therefore, the African Group welcomes the convening of this historic conference. The result of this conference, we believe, will significantly contribute towards nuclear disarmament worldwide. Africa is a nuclear weapons-free zone as under the Pelindaba Treaty. We highly value the principle of complete nuclear disarmament. This is a precondition to achieving and maintaining international peace and security. The group also attaches importance to the validity and importance of multilateral diplomacy in the area of disarmament, non-proliferation, and international security. We recall that there is no substitute to maintaining international peace and security.
The Africa Group wishes to reiterate that the support of a legal binding instrument to ban nuclear weapons is a very positive step and is, without prejudice to the realization of existing nuclear disarmament commitments, particularly those agreed to in the framework of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. As we approach the 2020 review cycle of the NPT, it is imperative that to recognize that the vitality and relevance of the treaty as the cornerstone of the international nuclear non-proliferation regime is dependent on the extent to which state parties, in particular nuclear weapon states, implement their obligations and commitments. In a world saddled with the burden of thousands of nuclear warheads that remain either operationally deployed or in storage, the group wishes to restate that the continued existence and possession of these weapons does not guarantee security. To the contrary, given the probability and risks of their use, nuclear weapons rather serve to undermine international peace and security. The Afghan group reaffirms the usefulness of nuclear weapons-free zones in the consolidation of the NPT, as well as their contribution to addressing nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation across all regions of the world. The treaties of Tlatelolco for Latin American and Caribbean, Rarotonga for South Pacific, Bangkok for Southeast Asia, Pelindaba for Africa, and the Central Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone, as well as the Mongolia's nuclear weapons-free status, significantly contribute to the overall objective of a world free of nuclear weapons. They all enhance regional and global peace and security, strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and contribute towards realizing the objectives of nuclear disarmament and the international objective of establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, according to NPT resolutions of 1995, serves the same cause. The African countries that have ratified it remain committed to the Treaty of Pelindaba, which entered in force on the 15th July 2009. The treaty once again reaffirms the status of Africa as a nuclear weapons-free zone and provides a shield for the African territory, including by preventing the stationing of nuclear explosive devices on the continent and prohibiting testing of those weapons, among others. The Africa Group firmly believes that the mere possession of any use of nuclear weapons is a violation of the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, in particular international humanitarian law. The group, therefore, further reiterates its serious concern that the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and continues to call on states, particularly the non-weapon states, to consider the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of these weapons on human health, the environment, and vital economic resource, among others, and take the necessary measures aimed at dismantling and renunciation of these weapons. In that light, the group welcomes the 3 international conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons convened in Oslo, Nayarit, and Vienna to highlight the danger of nuclear weapons to humanity. These conferences have confirmed that the issue of nuclear weapons is not only a security concern for those who possess such weapons, but for all of humanity. Madam Chair, in concluding, the Afghan Group wishes to reaffirm that it strongly supports the call for the banning of nuclear weapons, the only weapon of mass destruction not prohibited by an international legal instrument. In line with this, the Afghan Group looks forward to participate actively in this conference towards its conclusion, and once again, you can count on our continued support and cooperation. I thank you very much.
Le agradezco.
I thank the permanent representative of Cabo Verde to the United Nations, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the UN, speaking on behalf of the Caribbean community.
Madam President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. CARICOM would like to congratulate you, Madam President, on your election to lead this conference. We assure you of our cooperation and full support as we have every confidence in your leadership. CARICOM aligns itself with the statement delivered by El Salvador on behalf of the Community of Latin America and Caribbean States, CELAC. Madam President, this conference is faced with an historic task as we meet to begin our efforts to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. We are here to finally advance discussions with the objectives of filling the legal gap that currently exists with regarding the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons, including the general regulations and prohibition against possession, use, development, production, stockpiling, and transfer of such weapons. We all can recall the optimism and determination that we felt as we, the majority of governments, voted to start working on this treaty. We further recall the momentum that has been growing, particularly in light of the knowledge that, of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. Any assessment of the humanitarian impact that provides an unassailable proof that nuclear weapons cause loss of life and displacement on a catastrophic scale that permanently damage the health of individuals, our environment, and irreplaceable damage to social and economic development and to the social order of our societies. These humanitarian impacts must remain at the forefront of our efforts as we discuss, because the risk of catastrophic consequences will remain as long as nuclear weapons exist. CARICOM states reaffirm our commitment to this process for which we are gathered and pledge to work to maintain the momentum and the global effort in the global community that seeks to ensure the adequate action is taken to prohibit nuclear weapons so that no state or community has to ever grapple with the devastation that will be caused if nuclear weapons are used. Madam President, CARICOM member states stand with the rest of the world as we are aware too well of the unparalleled harm and destruction that nuclear weapons can pose to humankind. We therefore have a long-standing policy in our region of total elimination of nuclear weapons in line with the 3 pillars of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of these weapons. CARICOM's commitment to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation is further embodied in the participation of all its member states in the Treaty of Tagaloko, which in turn established the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean region. It is a source of satisfaction and pride to us in CARICOM that the Treaty of Tagaloko commands universal adherence in Latin America and the Caribbean, and stands firm in the world as the first nuclear weapon-free zone in areas of large population density. We are proud with our friends around the world to celebrate the 50th anniversary of this treaty. Moreover, our commitment to a nuclear weapon-free world is in keeping with the special declaration on the commitment to advance multilateral negotiations on the nuclear disarmament, which was adopted by heads of government and the member states of the Caribbean community and Latin America. It is our view that nuclear weapons-free zones have been central to the reinforcing the commitment made by member states, and their establishment has laid a strong foundation of high standards that can be reinforced and strengthened in our discussions in this conference. In terms of collaboration, Madam President, we at CARICOM acknowledge the role of civil society and their ongoing support in the efforts and their endeavors to encourage and work for disarmament of nuclear weapons. We encourage this collaboration further. Madam President, CARICOM continues to argue that nuclear weapons have no utility in today's world. They are not useful deterrent, but rather cultivate a state of insecurity and false defensiveness that only increases the chances of proliferation with devastating impact upon all of us far beyond the parties that are directly involved. We, as small island states, are particularly aware of our vulnerability. We are aware of the porousness of our marine borders. We are aware of our strategic location. We are aware of the threat, may be soft, but we are aware of the threat of potential nuclear terrorism because of our size and our inability to be totally protected. CARICOM would like to restate that the international security environment and the role of nuclear weapons in existing security doctrines must be put on the table in full for the discussions this week. We must build bonds of trust that will bring about meaningful and constructive dialogue that we all can reaffirm the collective security is not mutually exclusive to national security, especially with regards to nuclear weapons. We are our brother's keeper. Madam President, CARICOM would like to emphasize the additional value in this conference of us stigmatizing nuclear weapons, bringing and building awareness of the danger and devastation of these weapons so that we can help to influence policies and practices around the world and draw global attention to the danger of these weapons. In closing, Madam President, CARICOM wishes this conference a very successful landing. We have confidence in your leadership. The road ahead is difficult, but we are confident that with the negotiations in this week, we will achieve. I thank you.
Le agradezco.
I thank the permanent representative of Antigua and Barbuda. I call now on the permanent representative of Japan to the Conference on Disarmament.
Madam President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, Japan has a mission as the only country which has experienced the devastation of the wartime use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to raise awareness on the reality of atomic bombings and create recognition of its humanitarian consequences across borders and generations. Through this effort, Japan has devoted itself to uniting the international community toward the advancement of nuclear disarmament and to working together with other countries towards our common goal, to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. In order to make our step towards a world free of nuclear weapons, Japan has consistently advocated that it is essential to build up practical and concrete measures on the basis of cooperation between nuclear states and non-nuclear weapon states, while not losing sight of a clear recognition of the humanitarian aspects of the use of nuclear weapons and an objective assessment of the international security environment. Japan believes that this approach is the most effective path toward in reaching a world free of nuclear weapons. Our confidence in this position remains steadfast. In order for us to step forward together, and in light of the current severe international security situation, I would like to take this opportunity to articulate the approach we have upheld, the path forward that will lead us to the elimination of nuclear weapons and concrete measures for nuclear disarmament. Nuclear disarmament and national security are closely linked. It is evident that disarmament will not be feasible without regard for the existing security concerns. We must not turn away our eyes from the current security situations in the international community, which are increasingly worsening. In particular, North Korea, since last year, has conducted 2 nuclear tests and launched more than 20 ballistic missiles in clear violation of the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. And moreover, it is vocal in its intention to become a nuclear power. This poses a real and imminent security issue facing not only the East Asian region, but also the international community as a whole. This is also a serious challenge to the international nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime centered around the NPT. It is therefore crucial to have a realistic perspective as to how nuclear disarmament measures can contribute effectively to addressing actual security concerns that each country and region face. Now let me elaborate on a path forward that we support based on the practical approach towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. As Japan has consistently advocated, the engagement of the nuclear weapon states is indispensable for the advancement of nuclear disarmament. What is most important is to build confidence and trust among states, including nuclear weapon states, and thereby accumulate various realistic and practical measures through bilateral and multilateral efforts, such as agreeing on a concrete measure to reduce nuclear weapons. It is also necessary to resolve regional issues and thereby to remove the elements that give states motives to possess nuclear weapons. In this way, we have to accelerate our efforts to create an enabling security environment for the elimination of nuclear weapons. After accumulating such efforts through actions by all countries, including nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, we can then expect to reach what our proposed progressive approach calls a minimization point, at which the number of nuclear weapons will be very low. Only when this achievement is within reach will it be possible to make an effective and meaningful legal instrument as the final building block to achieve and maintain a world free of nuclear weapons. At that stage, we will be able to give further thought to an appropriate framework for nuclear disarmament, including a multilateral nuclear weapon convention, which should be not non-discriminatory and internationally verifiable. We must correctly appreciate the fact that the current international regime under the NPT has contributed to international peace and stability. Therefore, it is crucial that a new legal instrument must strengthen the existing nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime supported inter alia by the NPT. The delicate balance and groundwork so far created and maintained by the NPT regime towards realistic nuclear elimination must also be preserved. Japan firmly believes that we will be able to achieve our common goal of a world free of nuclear weapons through persistent efforts in advancing concrete measures and steady dialogue. Based on the approach I have just explained, with engagement with nuclear weapon states, Japan will be dedicated to carrying forward the following concrete nuclear disarmament efforts in order to implement steadily and effectively nuclear disarmament measures, as agreed by the international community through such as fora at the NPT. First, Japan has been contributing to the NPT review process to strengthen the NPT as the cornerstone of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. For example, Japan has been playing a leading role in the NPDI, a cross-regional group of non-nuclear weapon states, which has proposed concrete measures, such as increasing transparency. Japan attaches particular importance to improving the transparency of nuclear forces as a concrete and crucial step for a world free of nuclear weapons. In this regard, we are calling upon the nuclear weapon states to conduct concrete and regular numerical reporting. We will continue to emphasize increased cooperation of the international community as a whole toward the successful 2020 NPT review process, which will begin in May this year. Second, Japan is committed to making progress in advancing concrete and practical measures, especially in those fora where decisions on concrete steps are made with the participation of nuclear weapon states. This effort includes the following. For 23 years in a row, Japan has submitted resolutions calling for united action toward the total elimination of nuclear weapons to the United Nations General Assembly, which have gained overwhelming support. We have also made active contributions towards an early entry into force of the CTBT over the past 20 years by providing technical and financial support, in addition to patient and steady diplomatic efforts. Furthermore, in order to demonstrate the will of the international community not to allow the further production of nuclear weapons, Japan is willing to actively participate in the discussions at the high-level expert preparatory group established under the United Nations towards early commencement of negotiation of an FMCT. Regarding nuclear disarmament verification, which is an essential element for the actual elimination of nuclear weapons, Japan is making active contributions for the establishment of a group of governmental experts on nuclear disarmament verification under the United Nations, and to the activities of the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification. These are all approaches with the involvement of nuclear weapon states. Last year, at the G7 Foreign Ministerial meeting in Hiroshima, G7 foreign ministers issued the Hiroshima Declaration on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. The declaration unequivocally confirmed the political commitments of all G7 member states, consisting of nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, including their persistent and active support for the reduction of nuclear weapons and for individual nuclear disarmament measures. As the next step, now it is time for each state to make sincere efforts to turn these commitments into actions and to deliver results. Japan will continue making proactive contributions to such nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation fora, and is prepared to offer proper opportunities for dialogue and cooperation. At the UN General Assembly last year, the resolution to convene this conference was adopted. As a country having experienced the catastrophe of nuclear weapons, Japan fully understands and shares the frustration among non-nuclear weapon states due to the present slow pace of nuclear disarmament and the sincere desire to urgently achieve substantive progress in nuclear disarmament. Japan has called upon nuclear weapon states to squarely and faithfully examine the backdrop of a ban treaty and to exhaust their efforts towards advancing nuclear disarmament. Japan has also had earnest discussions with many non-nuclear weapon states on nuclear disarmament, including the idea of a ban treaty in various international conferences. A ban treaty, if it does not lead to an actual reduction of a single nuclear warfare, would be of little significance. In fact, efforts to make such a treaty without the involvement of nuclear weapon states will only deepen the schism and division, not only between nuclear weapon states, not only between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, but also among non-nuclear weapon states, which will further divide the international community. Therefore, our common goal will be pushed away, a goal of reaching a world free of nuclear weapons. Even if such a ban treaty is agreed upon, we don't think that it would lead to the solution of real security issues, such as threats by North Korea. This is why we voted against the UN General Assembly Resolution 71/258 last year. From discussions and considerations so far, it has become clear that the ban treaty concept has been unable to obtain understanding and involvement of nuclear weapon states. Furthermore, this negotiation hasn't been formulated to pursue nuclear disarmament measures that will actually lead to the elimination of nuclear weapons in cooperation with the nuclear weapon states. Regrettably, given the present circumstances, we must say that it would be difficult for Japan to participate in this conference in a constructive manner and in good faith. What is essential is to pursue practical and effective measures with the engagement of both nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states. As Japan has consistently continued to pursue as Japan has consistently maintained, as we sincerely aspire to see a world free of nuclear weapons, we will continue to pursue realistic and effective disarmament measures, and will work to create a security environment conducive to the elimination of nuclear weapons. In closing, let me be clear and reiterate Japan's unwavering commitment. Japan will continue to place great value on constructive dialogue and cooperation within the international community. To advance effective and inclusive efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons, we will demonstrate our initiatives, such as providing a venue for interactive exchanges of views among countries that hold varied approaches on nuclear disarmament. I thank you for your kind attention.
Le agradezco.
I would like to thank the permanent representative of Japan to the Conference on Disarmament. I call now on the permanent representative of Algeria to the United Nations.
Madam President, it's great to be here at this most likely historical juncture. We are opening a new trail with certainly a lot of difficulties, obstacles, and misunderstandings. But it is a necessity. We owe it to the world. And a huge majority has decided to open this path for everyone's sake and in the name of the very reason we are here at the United Nations: promote peace, prevent war through multilateral endeavors. Madam President, this is truly a historical conference you are presiding over today. It represents the outcome of tireless advocacy efforts of states, organizations, and civil society alike, who believe in the sanctity of a world free of nuclear weapons. More, this conference is the result of the dedication of all those who are convinced that we have to do something, that we have to listen to strong messages, like the moving one delivered this morning by the Hibakusha, and to all those who do not want to continue betting on the unbearable risk of annihilating the humanity. So thanks to all stakeholders who bear high the very first pledge made by the first United Nations General Assembly, and thanks to all who believe that we have to do something. And today is the day to start discussing a legally binding international instrument to prohibit nuclear arms. Madam President, let me say it very clearly at this stage. My country, Algeria, will definitely bring its full support to all initiatives leading towards the prohibition and total elimination of all weapons of mass destruction. And specifically today, the only weapon of mass destruction that is still to be dealt with is the nuclear one. Clearly, we have welcomed the report of the open-ended working group created by UNGA 7033, UNGA Resolution 7033, and we strongly support its recommendations. It's a source of hope that for the first time in 20 years, we have something in the field of multilateral negotiations for nuclear disarmament. Clearly also, the most difficult part is to drag and convince all those who have different views, and we have to continue to call on them to join the logics of hope and openness against any other logics. Let's stop for a while and try to project ourselves in the future. How will be our world in the next 100 years? Shall we bequest to the next generation the fear or the hope? Exchanging vows of peace or threat to annihilations? It is hard to imagine that on behalf of narrow logics, we'll continue to invest in even more sophisticated and destructive capacities. Are we looking for a new form for the end of history? We simply refuse these logics, because we strongly believe that the collective security of all, as stated in the United Nations General Charter, is to be reached out through confidence, diplomacy, and based on the very reasons we all have argued about for biological and chemical weaponry, there is no difference for nuclear ones. Madam President, we do not start out of nothing or out of nowhere. We'll be following the next NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, RevCom, as it is hard not to see it, the NPT, as a parallel trail. We should not forget all the regional efforts also. In Africa, we have the Pelindaba Treaty that come to support our endeavors in biological and chemical conventions. Of course, we have also the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement of the IAEA. So our gathering today is also the opportunity to renew all these commitments. There are no reasons, no excuses, no ifs, no buts, no strings to be attached for the very idea of the development, production, acquisition, possession, storage, transfer, use, or threat of use of nuclear weapons. As we cannot ignore no more the humanitarian impact of this weaponry, as it was highlighted by the 3 international conferences held in Oslo, Nayarit, and recently in Vienna with the adoption of the humanitarian pledge. Let me recall at this juncture that more than 20 years ago already, the International Court of Justice has reminded the whole international community that these weapons are not in conformity with the international humanitarian law. Madam President, I speak today on behalf of a country that knows what are the consequences of nuclear testing. Open-air nuclear tests were conducted on the soil of my country almost 60 years ago, and we are still assessing today the horrendous effects on the population and on the environment. I speak also out of the frustration of seeing that none of the 13 measures to materialize nuclear disarmament agreed upon in the 20,000 NPT RevCom and endorsed by the 2010 NPT RevCom are far from being implemented. So, Madam President, this is very briefly what I wanted to share with you today as the representative of Algeria, but also in my capacity as the chair of the first committee of the 71st session of the United Nations General Assembly. But let me assure you that in your very difficult task, you'll always have us at your side and at the side of all who think our collective security cannot, who think that our collective security cannot be built over fear. And thank you.
Le agradezco al
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Algeria to the United Nations.
The last speaker in the high-level segment for this meeting. We shall continue the high-level segment this afternoon at 3 p.m. in Conference Room 4 after taking up all procedural and organizational matters. I will now give the floor to the Secretariat for an operational announcement.
Thank you, Madam President. The Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, OPNAL, is hosting an event today entitled 50 Years of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, an Inspiration to the World. And this event will be held in the ECOSOC chamber at 1:15 p.m. this afternoon. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned. The first plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading toward their total elimination, is called to order. Mr. Acting President of the General Assembly, Mr. High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Mr. Secretary General of the Conference, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all participants to this conference. I should like also to take this opportunity to express once again my deepest appreciation to all states for the great privilege and distinction they have bestowed upon my country by electing me as president of this vitally important conference. Personally, I am indeed honored and deeply indebted to all of you for the trust and confidence you have placed in me. You can be assured that I will do my best with your assistance and cooperation to work towards achieving our collective goal of concluding a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. Si me lo permiten,
if I may, I wish to provide some comments in my native language of Spanish. Those of us gathering here today in this room, we are privileged. These walls have witnessed the clamor of heads of state of all regions of the planet to eliminate nuclear weapons, practically since this building was inaugurated. The wait has been long, that's true, but this clamor has not been in a void. The General Assembly, the most universal body of the United Nations, took a decision to convene this conference to prohibit nuclear weapons and hence lead towards their total elimination. It is said of Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant minds, he said when he was asked a question, what weapon would be able to counter and tackle nuclear weapons? To that question, he responded without hesitation, this can only be possible using the best weapon of all, peace. Achieving peace is a foundational value of the United Nations and the foundation for multilateralism par excellence. And we are witnessing this here today at this conference. In launching this conference, this aspiration for a better world brings me to recall a
days. Thank you.
I thank the acting President of the General Assembly of the United Nations for his statement. I now have the pleasure to invite Mr. Kim Won-soo, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, to make a statement.
Her Excellency, Ms. Ellen White Gomez, President of the Conference, Mr. Masoud bin Momen, Acting President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to represent the Secretary General at the opening of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. Secretary General Guterres sends his best wishes as well as his sincere regrets. Unfortunately, he is currently traveling on official business. At the outset, I wish to warmly congratulate Ambassador Ellen White Gomez on her election as President of the conference. She will have the full support of the United Nations Secretariat as she seeks to fulfill her historic and challenging task. This conference is taking place against a backdrop of rising international tensions, renewed arms competition, and an absence of results in disarmament bodies. The Secretary General recognized these developments when he recently described our world as a one of new and old conflicts woven in a complex, interconnected web where global tensions are rising, sabers have been rattled, and dangerous words spoken about the use of nuclear weapons. On top of these interconnections are warring trends that are threatening to undo the gains we have made since the end of the Cold War. This makes the need for a breakthrough all the more urgent. Two factors are increasingly impeding the ability of the international community to respond effectively. The first factor is the dismissiveness and defeatism that permeates international deliberations on disarmament. The long paralysis in the United Nations disarmament bodies has prompted many to retreat into entrenched and inflexible positions. This has unfortunately become the new normal. Yet, history has proven that progress on disarmament can only be made when we can pursue inclusive dialogue, respect our differences, and listen to each other in a spirit of compromise and flexibility. The second factor is the diminishing awareness and interest in disarmament issues by the global public. It is hard to imagine these days a gathering of 1 million people in the streets in support of nuclear disarmament as we often saw in the 1980s. We need to find a new way to inspire and motivate the global public in support of disarmament in the same way that they have been energized to respond to the challenge of climate change, an existential threat facing.
I have the honor to deliver the following statement on behalf of the President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Peter Thompson, who unfortunately cannot be here today due to other multilateral commitments. Good morning to you all. President of the Conference, High Representative of the Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Secretary General of the Conference, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to thank the President of the Conference, Her Excellency Ambassador Elaine Witt Gomez of the Republic of Costa Rica, for inviting me to address today's meeting. For nearly 7 decades, the United Nations has been engaged in long and painstaking discussions to try and rid the world of its nuclear arsenal. While the call to eliminate nuclear weapons has long resonated among all member states, the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons continues to be out of reach. Although current nuclear stockpiles are at the lowest levels since the end of the Cold War, it is self-evidently clear that so long as any nuclear weapons continue to exist, they pose an unacceptable risk to humanity. One misstep, one poor judgment, one technical failure, or one determined non-state actor gaining access to nuclear weapons could lead to unimaginable devastation, including mass casualties and destruction, and long-term health, environmental, climate, economic, and sustainable development consequences. It is no wonder that nuclear weapons continue to be a source of understandable fear and mistrust among nations. In addition, the cost of producing, maintaining, modernizing, and enhancing nuclear weapons diverts large sums of public resources away from other critical areas of investment, including to social and economic services and to sustaining peace, all of which would reduce the threat to international peace and security. Indeed, if the funds currently spent on nuclear weapons were redirected towards implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, great strides could immediately be made in our efforts to strengthen global security. Excellencies, it is in this context that the decision taken by the General Assembly earlier this session to convene a United Nations conference in 2017 to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons creates a window to bring new impetus to nuclear disarmament efforts. I encourage you to bear this in mind as we begin our negotiations. As with any major intergovernmental process, sensitive and complex issues will be raised, but with vision, determination, political will, and a willingness to work together to find common ground, these hurdles can be overcome and a solution that is acceptable to all can be reached. Indeed, all governments have previously committed to pursuing precisely this aim, working towards a world free of nuclear weapons. I wish you all constructive and fruitful negotiations in the coming.
A Costa Rican poet who said once that I believe in freedom. I believe in freedom in spite of obstacles. I believe in peace, beloved peace, in spite of bombs. We should be guided by dialogue above discord. We must be guided by consensus above negligence. Coexistence must guide us. The smiles of children, we must bear these in mind. And we must recall that peace triumphs above all over nuclear weapons. For me personally, this task began on 16 February when you appointed me as president of this conference. Over the past 6 weeks, we have undergone intensive work in Geneva, New York alike, and I endeavor to do my utmost to ensure that our work is successful and ensure the greatest level of understanding between participants and to work in an orderly fashion. We have had bilateral, multilateral meetings with many of you and across the Atlantic. I've had the opportunity to understand the views of civil society and to exchange on criteria with many from academia and nuclear disarmament realms. Clearly, we are only just beginning in this path. And at this stage, I wish to thank you very much for this spirit of dialogue and your constructive spirit. I also wish to thank the Secretariat and the Costa Rican team, which is led today by our Minister of Foreign Affairs, who has honored us with his presence here today. The task of negotiating a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons is only just beginning today. I wish to appeal to all delegations to join efforts to obtain through this process the best possible results. This week, we will debate aspects relating to this instrument, elements it must contain. We will have substantive and very high-level discussions here. Prior to the sessions, I will try to analyze all the proposals made so that we can have an initial draft. My aim is to prepare this first draft starting in the spring so that we can see the shape of this instrument. Starting today, right now, we are rolling up our sleeves and beginning our work.
I have now the pleasure and honor to invite His Excellency Mr. Masoud bin Momen, Acting President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, to make a statement.
Humanity. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, the continued existence of nuclear weapons still poses yet another existential threat to humanity. The need for progress in nuclear disarmament has rarely been as urgent as it is today. The doomsday clock, indicating how close the humanity is to global catastrophe, has been set at 2.5 minutes to midnight, worst since 1953, worst than any other time, even at the height of the Cold War. The emergence and rapid dissemination of advanced new types of weapons and related concepts are increasingly creating a double blurring of the line, both between strategic and non-strategic weapons and between nuclear and conventional weapons. Also troubling, countries that possess nuclear weapons are spending billions of dollars to modernize their arsenals and to make weapons that are more capable and more usable. The endless pursuit of nuclear and non-nuclear strategic weapons will not create security. Rather, it has the potential to provoke new and destabilizing arms races and to exacerbate regional and global tensions. These technologies can alter deterrence calculations and may lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons with devastating consequences. If we are to achieve the total elimination of nuclear weapons, we will ultimately need to reverse these trends. The possession of nuclear weapons, which are linked with the threat of their use, is fundamentally incompatible with humanity's common aspiration for peace and security. It will remain difficult to achieve these shared aspirations when countries continue to rely on nuclear weapons in their security doctrines. The strengthening of international norms against nuclear weapons is an important step. To make progress beyond this, we will also need to reflect on the basic objectives of the disarmament process as they are enshrined in the United Nations Charter. In this connection, our goals have always been broader than eliminating or restricting problematic types of arms. Disarmament was meant as an integrated approach to address the larger problem of war and to facilitate arrangements for the collective maintenance of international security. Under the rubric of general and complete disarmament, for the past several decades, member states have pursued systematic and progressive steps toward this end. This approach has led to important instruments, including the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones around the world, as well as bans on nuclear testing, various inhumane weapons, anti-personnel landmines, and cluster munitions. In moving forward, I believe we need to find a way to modernize our historical vision of general and complete disarmament and transform it into a new paradigm for sustainable security. Madam President and distinguished delegate, I would like to conclude with three personal hopes. First, it is my sincere hope that instrument